welcome to the podcast.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for having me.
Okay, how are you doing?
Good, good. Doing well. How about you?
I'm doing well. It's not like I asked you this like a few minutes ago. Yeah, I hope you're good. You said you're good like 5 minutes ago. I'm excited to have this podcast. I'm excited to like talk to you. I emailed my friend and I talked to her like because sometimes talk through email and sometimes talk through WhatsApp. And I was telling her I'm going to talk to Godisulo, and she was like, "Oh my God, yes," because like we usually send each other your TikToks.
Oh, that's so nice. That's cool. Thank you.
Yeah. So, what is your definition of quality education?
Hmm. Super casual question. It's how are you doing? And then what is education? Super, super casual. Uh, yeah, I think to me, there is a very strong link towards education and freedom, and equality education is greatly involved with a person's freedom. And I think that way because there's kind of, I guess, two layers of it. There's a practical sense of freedom that you get with education and that you have more options in life, generally speaking. But then I think there's a more kind of metaphysical soul freedom that you can get. And there's, I guess, kind of two different reasons why I think that. The first being that my father was the first person in our like lineage to get educated, like at all, to go to school to learn to read and write. And there certainly have been a lot of opportunities, obviously, that he's gotten being able to read and write. You know, it sounds like something we can take for granted. But as wise as my grandparents were, and a lot of our family that didn't go to school, as wise as they were, in terms of the things you can do in the world, there's a limitation in that sense. And so there's kind of that physical sense of freedom. And then on the more metaphysical level, I'm reminded of a class I took during my undergrad. I took a history of education class, which was honestly where I first thought of wanting to study African philosophy, funny enough. And it was history of education from like the ancient Greeks until right now. And we talk about the liberal arts education. And for the Greeks, that was the purpose of it. There are things that you must learn to be free. And that is what an education does. And so I think fundamentally there's a soul freedom you get from being educated and understanding the world in a very deep sense. And there's, of course, the material freedom that comes with being able to move around because you're educated. And so to me, yeah, education is a thing about freedom.
Right. And you've talked about how, like, your grandfather, for example, didn't get, like, quote unquote, formal education. And I was going through what the Kenyan presidents learned and what, like, they studied while they were growing up to, like, tertiary education. And, there was that blend of informal education and formal education. And I'm wondering, because, like, right now, there's, like, if we think of education, we think of schools, we think of, structures that relate with textbooks, we think of blackboards and stuff like that. Do you think that that should only be the facet of education, or we should also incorporate the informal aspect, which I feel like right now it's not really meshed into the education system?
Yeah, there's certainly many elements to it, I think, because I mentioned just a few moments ago that my grandparents who didn't go to school were still wise. There are still things that you know even if you never go to school. My mother is fond of saying that there are some people that went to school, but school didn't go through them. And so, yeah, you can go to school and you can have as many degrees as you want. That doesn't stop you from saying the most ridiculous things. And so, yeah, there is kind of an education that comes with existing in the world and being very, very curious about it and being conscious of the weird, different things that are around you and wanting to figure stuff out. Um, I think there is, because now I'm thinking in the Nigerian sense, if I would say that I believe that we put an overemphasis on school education and not other things, and the the problems that that might be causing for the polity. I wonder about that. Yeah, we do overemphasize certain things that we probably shouldn't emphasize as much as we should. And yeah, the very kind of act of checking all the boxes of going to school is sometimes focused on more than what you're actually doing in school. So yeah, I'd have to think about that a bit more actually, about if I think that in the case of Nigeria, for instance, we might be focusing too much on sending kids into buildings to learn numbers when there's something else we could be doing. Yeah, that's an interesting thought.
I feel like in a way, as you said, like there are two facets of education, the soul aspect and the material aspect. I feel like in a way, the informal aspect of education that, say, your grandfather got, in a way ties to the soul aspect because they teach you character.
Hmm.
Because
Hmm.
as you've said, like material aspect sometimes leans more toward checking boxes.
Yeah.
Um, and then now I'm thinking of a paradox where I don't know if it's a paradox, honestly, but I'm thinking of a situation where we have to check boxes in one instance, but in another instance, of course, like we have to always have this structure in which you're, you know, uh, progressing in life. So, how do we reconcile the two where education is tailored in such a way that we're not checking boxes? Because like
Yeah.
sometimes people just check the boxes. Oh,
Yeah.
okay. And I don't know if checking boxes can still be existent. How can you make it so that people can still check boxes and still get the qualitative aspect of education, the soul aspect of education,
Yeah.
the curiosity aspect of education?
Yeah. It's very it's it's a very difficult question because in a in a somewhat roundabout way, I don't know if this it will be apparent why I think this connects, but I think of a sentiment that Martin Luther King Jr. had, that the race problem in the United States is a question of getting people to follow laws that are unenforceable. There are some laws that you can't enforce. There are some things you can't legislate. You can't legislate love. You can't legislate justice. And so getting people to follow things that are not legislated is very difficult. And so I think in the realm of education, we can have a situation where you build a school and you create a syllabus and you send children through the motions, and yeah, they learn all the things, they learn the letters, they learn to read and write, they do what they're meant to do, but there's always this uh higher, I guess, mode of instruction, mode of engagement that's difficult to put into a syllabus. I mean, how do you put soul enrichment into a syllabus? Maybe you might just do that by focusing on the humanities, I suppose. And if you just give kids a bunch of books to read, we would hope that the soul would be enriched by doing that. But on some level, it can be difficult to figure out how to teach people to think on their character and how to be decent in the world. It's difficult to put that on paper. It's far easier to throw them in a room and teach them to multiply stuff. And so yeah, this soul aspect is a difficult one.
So your TikTok bio, this is what it says. It was very interesting when I saw it at first. You cannot shave a man's head in his absence. What were you thinking of when you were typing that when you were writing your bio?
Well, it's a Nigerian saying. You cannot shave a man's head in his absence. Well, I guess I find it really funny because I mean most of the times when it comes up, it's in fairly funny situations. What would be a good example? I don't know. It's like if somebody's it's it's one of those things that's kind of hard to explain now that I think about it. If I think of an example of where this comes up, I'll mention it. But the reason why I chose it initially was in the very early days of doing stuff on TikTok. I did a lot of African philosophy conversations, and to me, in some ways, the history of African philosophy as a discipline has been one where people have tried to do African philosophy, explain African philosophy, talk about African philosophy without Africans actually around, without Africans putting an input in it. So it's like you're trying to shave our head in our absence. And so it's like, you can't do that. You cannot shave my head in my absence. And so I need to be there to make sure I know what's happening. I mean, some of the early texts in the discipline of African philosophy, one of the most fundamental ones is Bantu Philosophy by the Belgian missionary Plessis Temples. It's an interesting book. It's very problematic in many ways, but it really was one of the texts that kickstarted the conversation of African philosophy. So the discipline has that as its legacy in a way. And I guess it's similar for African studies as well. African studies started uh in a very, I guess, European centered sense. And nowadays we're still trying to figure out what exactly it is separated from that legacy. But yeah, there have been too many instances of heads being shaved in the absence of the people that actually matter. And so fundamentally that's why that's there. Plus I always just still find it funny.
You've talked about how um, African philosophy, like it sounds okay, the fundamental aspect of African philosophy is Bantu philosophy. And you also said it's interesting but problematic. I'm
Yeah.
wondering, like, interesting but problematic in what way?
Sure. Yeah. So I said that the one of the fundamental texts in the discipline of African philosophy is the book Bantu Philosophy, and so it's interesting because it started a formal conversation in academia about African philosophy. If there is an African philosophy, what should it be? And it basically set us all down a path that's led us to where we are right now. Um, it was also, I mean, really, depending on how you quantify this, it was the first official time that the concept of philosophy was attributed to a group of people in Africa by a European who cared about such things. Because if you go even further back, there was at some point the belief that yes, Africans are incapable of philosophy. That's a whole long story. That goes a little bit to Hegel, goes a little bit to Kant. And so what you had were people uh, in anthropological circles engaging with African cultures and calling them anything except philosophical. But then Plessy Temple shows up and is like, okay, these people, the Bantu have philosophy. And it's problematic for a bunch of other reasons then, because of how he goes about it. Because at some point he basically says, I know you all think that primitive people don't have philosophy, but I'm here to tell you that they're still primitive, but they still have philosophy. So it's like, you could have said they're not primitive, but you ended up with, no, there's philosophy even among primitive people. But the way he kickstarted that conversation led to what would become known as ethnophilosophy, which was like the first attempt to define African philosophy. So African philosophy involves the myths and the proverbs and the traditions of African people, and that is their philosophy. And that was a very, I guess, noble effort to start with African philosophy, but then it led to a bunch of other debates where other African philosophers were like, is this really philosophy? Because culture is not necessarily philosophy. Uh, Culture is culture and philosophy is philosophy. How we define philosophy is, I mean, it's a whole other conversation, I suppose. But it's more like, depending on who you ask, culture, generally speaking, tends to be less critical than philosophy. Culture just involves the things that people do. And so to say that African cultures are philosophy is, well, A, to say that African philosophy is like inherently distinct from philosophy elsewhere. So the Europeans can think about stuff, but Africans are just like living stuff. And so that's their philosophy. So, I mean, so where's the room for thinking then in African philosophy? There were many debates about this in the 60s, 70s. It's like a whole thing. It's a whole rabbit hole. But Bantu philosophy, the book, was at the center of a lot of these things. And the way that temples approached the Bantu people and approached writing this philosophy, it just involved a lot of problems. The way he attributed things to them, the way it was mostly written, not really for the Bantu people, but for European audiences, that was a bit problematic. The way it kind of essentializes the Bantu, the way it makes a lot of weird sweeping claims about just like the African way of life or whatever, which is a term that, I mean, what does quote unquote the African way of life mean? So yeah, the book had there's a lot of stuff in.
Right. And it's interesting how you mentioned how culture and philosophy, I mean, they're distinct aspects. I don't you think that in a way, even like Western philosophy is influenced by the culture? So how can you separate the two? I mean, yes, you've said that philosophy involves more thinking and culture is like just to be, culture is your way of life. But I feel like in a way, philosophy is determined by someone's culture.
Hmm.
So um what are the two, like, say, distinctions of
Yeah,
philosophy and culture, and how
yeah,
can that be tied to now African philosophy?
yeah. So it's not. You are correct. It's a difficult distinction to make. The two are not exactly opposites. They do converse with each other, but the extent to which culture was held up in the African context was a bit problematic. It would be akin to saying if I went to Britain and I was like hiding in the bushes, spying on like a British family, and I see them making their tea, and I look at the way they make their tea. Okay, so you boil the water to a certain temperature in a kettle, then you put it in your cup, and then you put 2 cubes of sugar and a little bit of milk, and I go back home and I'm like, this is the British, this is what they believe, this is their philosophy. It's like, well, but they're British people thinking about things, right? That are more, some British people might even be questioning this method of making tea. And there are many different debates, really, among the British on how to make the perfect cup of tea. And that, whatever that is, as much as it's engaging with culture, it's a bit closer to philosophy. But for me to go home and be like, this is what, I mean, to make it even a one-to-one comparison, for me to go home and say, this is what Europeans believe, this is how they do tea. It's like, that's not, whatever that is, that's not philosophy. And so after like Bantu philosophy, after the ethnophilosophy thing started, one of the next attempts to do this was Henry Odera Oruka's sage philosophy. So his theory was that, well, instead of just taking cultures as a whole, let me go into these cultures and interview sages, interview wise people in the community. Ideally, these wise people, the idea was that these wise people, they exist in the culture, but at least they would have reflections on it as well, and might push back against certain things in the culture, and at least bring something a bit more formal to it, as opposed to just kind of living in it. And so I think that's philosophy and culture do have an interesting relationship, but they are not necessarily the same thing.
Right, gotcha. It's funny you've talked about tea. I was with my friends in the subway, and we had this like we talked about tea bags because I love tea,
Mm.
and we just like I don't know we stretched the analogy and we tied that to capitalism. It was insane, like subway conversations, I guess. What you've talked about, the fundamental aspect of African philosophy, which you've talked about, like Bantu philosophy, and I'm wondering like what makes it fundamental, and I feel like again, like people usually talk about, oh, when you want to think about something, say the history of education or the history of something, usually it goes back to ancient Greece.
Mhm.
I'm wondering, like, is it because that is like a reliable reference point? I mean, what makes something the first thing to happen?
Mhm.
Yeah.
So in the case of why I call Bantu philosophy fundamental, yeah,
Yes, and like just to tie that up to like how people usually talk about like ancient Greece is
yeah,
the bedrock of everything. Like,
yeah,
what makes it like that place where it sources everything and it's that
yeah.
everything emerges from there.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So I guess on the topic of Bantu philosophy, so yeah, when I say that, what I mean is, so Bantu philosophy is the title of the book, yeah, and I mean that the book was like the first one to be published that kind of blew up to have the African philosophy conversation. So yeah, I mean like the book was the foundation, not necessarily the philosophy of the Bantus, if that makes sense. Yeah, so the book was kind of the foundation. But on this topic of origins, though, it is very interesting and fairly complicated because we could have a conversation of African philosophy that begins in Egypt. Uh, we could, in the same way that some people would begin some histories of philosophy with the Greeks. We could do that, but this is actually a very complicated question. Uh, it's a complicated question because well, really, origins for anything are a bit tricky to make sense of. Because in a very tangible sense, depending on who you ask, you can hear a story of the history of philosophy that begins with the Greeks and like leads directly to the United States right now. It passes through Europe, it passes through Britain, and then it ends up in the US. And you can be told that story as though it's been a straight line, and then we would call that quote unquote Western philosophy. But that line is and has always been way more complicated than that. It zigzags all over the place, and it's strange. And something is similar for African philosophy. Like I said, we could trace it back to Egypt. Some people do and just kind of do that. And I don't have any particular big qualms with that per se, but I think the zigzagginess of it all not only makes the story of the history of philosophy more interesting, but it potentially makes it more complicated to distill into like a simple story. if that makes sense.
Yeah, totally. And given that, I don't know, Africa is the origin of humankind, can it really be traced to one source?
Yeah, it, yeah, it's this goes into all the meta philosophical conversations that have happened in the history of African philosophy, because an obvious question is, well, where did philosophy start? It's like, well, what do we mean by philosophy? Like, who was the first person to think a thought? Like, is that philosophy, or does it have to be a first person to come up with a method per se that we can look at? So that's one of the reasons why we give Socrates his flowers for this, because we can say, okay, here is an ancient figure, and whether or not he existed is, a different conversation. I tend to think he did, but that's besides the point. And so here's an ancient figure who did what we can call methodological asking. There was a process to the way he was asking. And so we can say, okay, maybe we can pinpoint that as kind of a start place. Because we need to discipline ourselves somehow. Because if philosophy is just thought, thinking, if it's just creativity, if it's just asking questions, then the first philosopher was, I don't know, the first human that asked his friend something. And maybe that's the only correct answer. But yeah, the zigzags do be zigzag.
You also talked about Afrocracy in one of your podcast episodes. Yeah, so I'm wondering, could you please walk us through what Afrocracy is?
Afrocracy is something that, for better or worse, I found myself really captivated by and fell down a few rabbit holes on this. And really, what was jarring to me was the fact that Afrocracy, it's very spooky. It pops up every now and then in the literature, um, but no one properly defines what it is. No one defines it well enough, at least for my liking. It seems to suggest a an alternative to democracy. So there's democracy somewhere, and then there's Afrocracy, which is African democracy, which is our own form of democracy. And it's typically, uh, like I said, put side by side with democracy. It's sometimes implied that it's different from democracy. But then whenever anyone almost defines it, they basically just define a democracy but call it Afrocracy. And I'm like, okay, Afrocracy is based on consensus and citizens having a say in the government. I'm like, okay, democracy. Um, but for more than that, I was interested in the fact that Afrocracy kind of has a an identity out in the world. There are people, there are Africans across the continent uh, who are feeling disillusioned with quote unquote Western liberal democracy, and some seek an alternative, and they adopt the term Afrocracy in somewhat formal senses. Olusegun Obasanjo, a former president of Nigeria, lately has been going around basically saying this: Western liberal democracy has failed in Africa. We need something more in line with our traditions. I think he uses the term Afro democracy. So it's kind of the same thing. We need something that is ours as Africans. We shouldn't just keep doing uh, what the West has given us. And democracy was a thing that the West has given us. I think that that story, as I've just explained it, I can understand why it would be captivating to some. I can understand why it almost sounds like it makes sense. But I think there are too many problems in that story that I just told for it to be for it to become something that someone truly believes in their heart of heart. There are too many questions that need to be answered before somebody uh can adopt this stance with any sense of, I guess, with any sense of truthfulness. And so Afrocracy became like this umbrella term for me to try and understand what's going on here and why I found this so uneasy, and what parts of this story are true and what parts of this story are false, and what parts of this story are very problematic, because some of them are very problematic to us as people. And so I initially wanted to understand the definitions of Afrocracy. I scoured everywhere that I could. I found what I think is every time it's popped up in the literature, basically since 1959 until right now. And yeah, what you find is a lot of people adopting it, but not providing the best definitions. And so I just kind of wanted to understand it more, put it out there, think about it a bit uh, to kind of see what it could be, I suppose. Uh, yeah,
And you seem to have to be getting into a lot of like rabbit holes and stuff like that.
that does
Uh,
happen. Yeah.
I'm wondering like what has been your favorite rabbit hole recently that you've gotten into?
Medieval Jewish philosophy. I've been, there's a philosopher named Maimonides who was a medieval Jewish philosopher, and depending on who you ask, is one of the greatest. And he had a lot of fascinating insights on philosophy of religion, and I was kind of captivated by one of his conversations on negative theology, and I wanted to make some sense of it because there were some parts that I didn't quite understand, but it turns out that's because he's just really mysterious about it, and it's a bit of a mystery to everyone. And so I want to make sense of it for some other projects I'm working on. So the most recent one has been a little bit of medieval Jewish philosophy.
You talked about the philosophy bro, and based off of like what I've understood of what the philosophy bro is this kind of person who does not have a full gist of the information, does not get into rabbit holes, and just like I guess they know how to I don't know, ask questions and seem like they know stuff. So who is a philosophy bro?
Another difficult question, because the question here is really, well, what makes the philosophy bro different from the philosopher? So one of the interesting things about Socrates is Socrates went around town asking people questions. Right? That was his thing. And he claimed that it was really just because he didn't know. So he was just asking. He just wanted to know. He was just innocently asking because he just didn't know stuff. And so if there was a man in the city who claimed to be wise, Socrates would go and start asking them a bunch of questions. What does it mean to be good? Well, being good means being nice to your neighbor. And then Socrates is like, well, why? It's like, well, because your neighbor is your friend. And then Socrates is like, well, why? And he basically keeps going till the person gets annoyed. And then Socrates is like, well, I guess no one's really wise. And so Socrates claims to be doing this legitimately because he wants to learn and because he doesn't believe that he knows anything. And so if that's true, then I suppose, okay, that's what a philosopher is. But there is a kind of person that weaponizes this process for I guess other ends, and I guess that's who a philosophy bro would be. So you're not asking questions because you actually want to learn anything or because you believe you don't know. You're kind of trying to make a very thinly veiled point, or you're trying to derail certain conversations for whatever purpose you see fit. And I think it's a very thin line because in practice the two people, the philosopher and the philosophy bro, are almost indistinguishable. They're doing the same thing, but it's more the rationale behind what they are doing might be fundamentally different. So the philosophy bro, I guess, is similar to the debate bro. That person is kind of is always wanting to do all these uh like rope people, I guess, into all these politically charged debates that are that serve their purposes, I suppose. But in practice, it's difficult to know what the difference between the two might be.
You've talked about weaponizing a process, and I'm wondering now, given that this digital age, we have like social media and stuff, and in the wake of misinformation and disinformation, or of us like being just bombarded with different stuff and AI right now, I'm wondering now how can someone use, say, TikTok in their benefit, given that the people who may masquerade as philosophers, may masquerade as good-willed people, but at the end of the day, they're not good-willed people and spread misinformation.
This reminds me of slight tangent, but is somewhat related. This reminds me of Family Guy, right? The cartoon. So Family Guy is. I used to be really into Family Guy, and because at its peak, it was really funny, even though it's always constantly offensive and problematic. But I suppose that's part of the fun, if you're into that, which I am. But one of the interesting things about Family Guy is back in the day, it would get protested every so often. So parents would go and protest it and ask the network to cancel it because it's offensive. And the writers of Family Guy, the creator of Family Guy, always had the same response. Like, it's not my job to to have you be responsible for what your kids are watching. Uh, if your kids are being exposed to this is him talking to the parents, it's more kind of on you. And that's an interesting take, I suppose, an interesting perspective. But it seems somewhat germane to this conversation because the issue is there are people doing sus things on TikTok. True. We who consume it, well, I also add to it to whatever end I do, but I also consume it sometimes. Although to be fair, my my For You page is less brainy than you might think. It's so it's so stupid, but that's probably for the best. But to those who consume it, it's like, okay, there's people doing sus things. How best can we approach that? Is it my responsibility to make sure that I know when someone's trying to sell me a bad political idea? Or is it the responsibility of TikTokers not to sell bad political ideas? It might be a two-way streak. It might be, everyone has a part to play. But I do think that as a person, if you are the one consuming things, uh, there is something to be said about you being mindful about who's selling you what. Because almost everyone's selling something. And I think when I think of the debate bro or the philosophy bro, uh, some of them are not as difficult to spot as others. Uh, to those who want to have debates about who should, who deserves to have rights, I suppose, or who deserves to exist as a human being, to those who want to have those debates in certain context on TikTok, you can you can almost clearly see that they're flirting a bit more with debate bro-ness. So I could have a conversation about where rights come from, because I think it is an interesting conversation, like in the history of ideas. When did we start talking about human rights and what are our rights actually grounded in? That's an interesting conversation that we can have. But am I going to talk to someone in a, I guess, what's the word I'm looking for, in a vulnerable position in society and start talking to them about who gets rights? And it sounds like I'm trying to get them to see that they shouldn't have rights. Like if I'm doing that, that just seems problematic. And so there's a conversation we can have about all of these things, but it's a matter of how the conversations look.
Right, and I think that ties to the question: should we sell heroin at the farmers market? And you made a TikTok on that. So I don't know. Could you break that down, that whole concept? Because I think it ties to what you've talked about.
This was me responding to another TikTok where the person says that you should not sell heroin at the farmer's market, and heroin is an analogy for bad ideas, for harmful ideas, for morally problematic ideas. Morally problematic ideas do not belong in the marketplace of ideas. And so in the same way that you should not sell heroin at the farmer's market, you should not bring like racist, sexist, Nazi ideas into general discourse. That's the idea. When I responded to the video, I don't think I quite I didn't reach one conclusion, if I remember correctly. That doesn't sound like something I would do. I can't conclude on anything to save my life, but I think it's worth thinking about because the question, should we sell heroin at the farmer's market? I think let's take the question literally, not as an analogy for a second. And my answer would be, so what will the heroin people do if we kick them out of the farmer's market or if we invite them in? What would they do? So if we kick them out of the farmer's market and they realize there's no market for heroin, let's stop making it and go work at a bank or something. If that's what's going to happen, then okay, let's kick them out of the farmer's market. Um, if they're going to double down on it and create some sort of black market. And I think the analogy that I added is if they're going to keep making their heroin and pollute the city's water supply while they're doing that so that little bits of heroin seep into people's taps every day, then okay, banishing them is not a great idea. You might as well just have them at the farmers markets so that you can at least keep an eye on them. And if they are going to be honest at the farmers market and they explain to people what heroin is, you would like to think most people would avoid it and not buy it, maybe. But that's assuming far too many things. So bringing it into the analogy, if you banish the bad ideas, will they go away? Probably not. If you keep them in the public eye, will they be honest about what they are selling and tell you what happens when you adopt these ideas? Also, probably not. Um, and so that makes the ideas question very, very difficult. In the video, I kind of walk through my experience thinking alongside the concept of freedom of speech. And there was a time where I was convinced that these ideas need to be brought out into the open so that they can be debated. I mean, what else can you do if you don't debate them? You don't want to become all dogmatic. But truth be told, I don't know. But I also think that the heroin analogy is not very good because bad ideas are not like heroin. They are probably more like I think a friend of mine who also makes TikToks refers to it as they're more like addictions. People who are infected by them are more like addicts than anything else. That's a different conversation if the thing that we are talking about is not a drug you can buy, but like a different drug that like exists in the that's airborne or something. It's possible this analogy has escaped us a little bit by now.
I also think this ties to Corruptok, like this whole conversation, because I mean, we started talking about how, like, TikTok, sometimes people may not be having the good intentions and stuff like that. And I think, in Corruptok in itself, like, I don't think that people have bad intentions when they make Corruptok memes. But I feel like in a way we may risk normalizing the memes and like, oh wait, yeah, corruption, I get the bag, and I get the bag when I become president or something. So what do you think about that? What do you think of Corruptok?
Yeah, yeah. Well, in in the most basic sense, it is pretty funny. I do find it pretty funny. So there's that. Great. So now that that's out of the way, I think I think that there are.
Wait, before you continue, may I
Yeah,
ask, what do you think makes it funny at its core?
that's a good question. That's a good question. Um, I mean, in a very simple surface level, on a surface level, the format is really funny. Like you have the music in the background, and it's like I see my president, like just doing something stupid, and then someone's like me and bro when we make it. That's just good. Also, it really might be a we do cope with these things by laughing. So there is a little bit of that as well. There's, of course, some truth in it. And on some level, it's so absurd to think about that, yeah, people really do be this corrupt. They do be doing this. And like, what else can you do but just laugh at the absurdity? It's like how, I mean, at the end of Sartre's No Exit, when everyone finds out that they're definitely in hell and they'll be in here forever, you just start laughing. I mean, what else do you really do? I mean, so as for why it's funny, yeah, the format's just format's just good. I don't know. It's like when I see uh people making edits for like my president for Tinubu, because it's usually like because it's funny in part because of the irony. Because when you make an edit for something or for someone, it's because they said something cool, so then you edit them with the music stuff. But like sometimes it's Tinubu saying something like really dumb and like really problematic, but it sounds. But the way he says it with so much gusto. So you put the edits make him look cool, and it's just the irony is fun. This makes me think of the conversation that comes up when we talk about um media literacy. So I like Breaking Bad. I love Breaking Bad. It's a wonderful show. But one thing that happens with the conversations around Breaking Bad is people ask, are you meant to look up to Walter White, right? The main character. Is he meant to be something to emulate? Because yes, the show makes him do some really cool things sometimes. He has some really cool lines sometimes, 110%. Is Walt kind of the good guy? Are you meant to endorse what he's doing? And so that's the conversation that happens. But then the flip side is that, well, obviously, no, Walt does some horrible things. He's not your guy. Like, yes, there can be something cool and alluring about this. We can showcase it, including showcasing the highs, but that doesn't mean it should be emulated. That doesn't mean it's good. That doesn't mean it should be believed. And I think that's a conversation that happens a lot when it comes to depicting any part, really, of um, of African phenomena, things that happen on the African continent. Because I can imagine a situation where somebody looks at this and then thinks that all we do is do corruption in our countries, and our leaders are like stupidly corrupt, and like that's all there is to us. Now, every so often, I get asked a question that's like, why are Africans just more corrupt? Why are African leaders just more corrupt than everyone else? And I think that's a wrong question. There's nothing that makes us fundamentally more corrupt than anyone else. I think in a lot of our countries, we just don't have very good systems to deal with corruption, so it's more in your face. But there's corruption everywhere. Corruption is like a human thing. But in the imaginary, it seems like we are more corrupt because of the way it's depicted, because of the way we talk about certain things. And Corruptok can add to that in that if it becomes truly viral, some people who never see Africa stuff on their FYP are now all of a sudden seeing corruption, and it like reinforces these images in their mind. Um, and so, in a world where we all had whatever the version of media literacy would be, we would know that, okay, this is a meme. It's describing something that's true, but never think that this is the whole thing. Like Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie says, the problem with stereotypes is not that they're untrue, but they're incomplete. And I think that incompleteness is important. So like 100%, Tinubu, I'm not a fan. Most of these presidents, they can just fill in the blanks. I'm not a fan of most of them. But obviously there's more to us than that. And there is certainly a worry that some people, this is kind of all they see and that's the only image that they get. That would be less than ideal. Uh, if there was some sort of solution to this, I don't know what it might be.
I mean the solution, haha, education, quality education, and I guess
Yeah.
privacy.
Yeah.
But you've talked about media literacy, which is very interesting because my research that I was talking about before we started filming, I was looking into like the whole thing of media literacy and like how people should report media, I guess news, and previously it was like uh, a person like a reporter who's reporting like they should be very neutral, and later on it was like neutrality is not very much like valued because it leads to lack of trust by the people. And right now the media houses and like other people who report news are shifting toward being more transparent. I guess I mean Corruptok is a reflection of transparency, I should
True.
say. But
True.
you also talked about Breaking Bad, which is also like an amazing, show. I also love Breaking Bad. It's just like phenomenal. And there's this one line that Walter White said, he's not the I don't know, he's not in danger, he is the danger. He's the one behind the door that knocks. I love that line.
Stop trying to justify this whole thing and admit you're in danger.
Who are you talking to right now? Who is it you think you see? Do you know how much I make a year? I mean, even if I told you, you wouldn't believe it. Do you know what would happen if I suddenly decided to stop going into work? A business big enough that it could be listed on the NASDAQ goes belly up. Disappears. It ceases to exist without me. No, you clearly don't know who you're talking to, so let me clue you in. I am not in danger, Skylar. I am the danger. A guy opens his door and gets shot, and you think that of me? No. I am the one who knocks.
Beautiful.
And it's interesting when you make some of your TikToks, you usually have like something playing in the background. And I'm wondering, like, do you usually watch the thing and then like you have something like that pops in your head and you choose to record? Or like why is it that something is usually playing in the background?
Yeah, so that was the thing I used to do. I don't do it, and my setup has changed, so I can't quite pull that off as easily as I used to. But so yes, and at any given time, I have something playing in the background. I like moving pictures because I'm a child. I mean, something is playing right now in the background. But sometimes I think it would be interesting to have whatever I'm saying match what's on the screen. So in a roundabout way, whenever I have something going on the screen, it's matching with what I'm talking about, even if the way you get there is a bit wavy. But most of the time it does. Yeah, so sometimes it's Breaking Bad, sometimes it's I think Better Call Saul, sometimes it's BoJack Horseman. I think once it was Powerpuff Girls. That one was probably just for fun. But yeah, generally speaking, it's in some roundabout way there is some connection. So that's usually the puzzle.
One of your TikToks, you talked about how logic is a vibe, emotions are a vibe as well. And, it's very interesting because as we've had this whole conversation, in a way, people usually, I guess, it goes back to our conversation on the soul versus the material. And I feel like, okay, I don't want to put it in very, black and white terms, but I feel like in a way, the soul matches to like the emotion and the material matches to logic. And sometimes we tend to think that they're two distinct, fields, two distinct, I guess, emotions. If logic can be, can be an emotion. What did you mean by that?
Yeah, so logic is a vibe, emotions are a vibe. That does sound like something I would say. Yeah, that sounds like me. Uh, um, uh, the context and really the purpose of it is probably to say that it's somewhat related, I think, to the philosophy bro-ness of it all, because the philosophy bro builds their castle upon being logical and being logically consistent, and that's fine. Logic is good. It's no beef with it. But I think if you are so logical, you become some sort of robot and you've lost your empathy and you're just not nice to the people around you, then that's not good. As cool as logic is, it's not. I mean, what's the point if you get to be a robot and then you're making people fundamentally not just uncomfortable, but it's leading to some type of hurt with people. Because in most simple senses, I have no qualms with making people uncomfortable if it's necessary. But of course, who decides who's necessary? That's a whole rabbit hole. But yeah, uncomfortability on its own is not an issue, especially when you're dealing with ideas, dealing with difficult conversations. But if logic is kind of like the hill you want to die on at the expense of everything and everyone else, then it seems important to know that, yeah, emotions are a vibe as well. And I put those two side by side in that they're both vibes because there are certainly instances where we want to throw our logic out the window and lean into the emotions, and that might also not be vibey. Both are vibes. And I think for some people, in some contexts, in some conversations, one gets overemphasized over the other. And it just seems important to me to know that both of those are vibes.
Right, and you've talked about how uncomfortability is necessary if you want to have difficult conversations. And I mean, you are, the epitome of someone who's studied in both the West and in Africa. That's not a reflection of the whole world, of course, but I feel like in my experience in America, there is a more it's harder to talk about difficult conversations because it gets to be very awkward real quick. I don't know if that has been the same with your experience. That's the first question. And given that like circumstances, I don't know. I don't know how you answer that because it's like I already assumed your answer. But given like the uncomfortability present when tackling different topics like say race or I don't know, colonization, how can we make it so that like the conversation, like we tackle the conversation? Trevor now talks about how he talked about this in the Daily Show, how like how race was talked about in I think how race is still talked about in South Africa. It's different from how it's talked about here in America because in America like they tend to be awkward, someone doesn't know how to act when they're talking about race and maybe they're the um oppressor, quote unquote oppressor group as compared to like how South Africans would talk about race. And I noticed that like very clearly when he came to the US. And I was like, okay, this is very interesting because the way Americans talk about race. I mean, they talk about race. We read books on race and stuff like that, but they don't really talk about race. So how best can that be? I don't know. How can we make it possible so that we talk about the uncomfortable topics and have a tangible conversation without, like, I guess, having the awkwardness? Is that even really possible? Yeah. So the first question, first of all, like, I'm wondering what your experience has been, because you've studied in the US, you've studied in Europe, and you've studied in Nigeria. Yeah.
So, uh, one of the, I guess, things that works somewhat well in my favor temperamentally is that I don't mind awkwardness. I don't shy away from it. It's not, it's not a wonderful thing, but I don't typically see it as a thing to be avoided. I don't mind. I like silence. I don't see silence as awkward. I don't mind awkwardness. I understand when things get awkward, sure, and I would never make things awkward. It's like I wouldn't know. It's not like I wouldn't know when things are awkward. I would know, but I don't mind it. Especially if it seems called for. Um, I when I moved here, the States, that's when I first left home. It was interesting. Initially, I had really no real business talking much about race. I didn't have much to say, to be honest, because yeah, it was all very new to me. And so the only kind of awkward-ish things that really weren't that awkward that I talk about were like religion stuff. So like in America, they say three things you never talk about: God, what is it, money, and there's a third thing I don't remember. And so you just talk about sports and the weather. I don't really care that much about the weather, and I don't really follow any sports, so I'm just going to talk about God all the time. And so, sure, I'd enter into somewhat religious conversations with some people early on, but those were fairly chill. Those weren't much of an issue. I've really only recently started having much more conversations about race, and partly because I'm having them mostly with academics, it's I guess not as awkward as it could be, but yeah, this stuff can get somewhat uncomfortable, but it's possible that sometimes you might have a moral responsibility to make certain things uncomfortable. So the philosopher Sarah Ahmed makes this argument in the Feminist Killjoy Handbook. The concept of the feminist killjoy is somebody who kills joy. So if you're in a room with people and they're making sexist jokes and it's like, oh, it's just a joke, like, will you be that one guy that's like, come on, guys, don't do that? Maybe sometimes you need to be if you exist in those spaces. And so there's an interesting conversation to be had there as to when it becomes a responsibility to make certain conversations awkward if need be. I don't think I've really found myself in any strong settings where anyone has been making any like diabolical racist or sexist comments where I had to like kill the vibe. I don't think I've encountered that really since I've been here. But in principle, if that ever happens, I have no qualms being that guy. I mean, I have no qualms being the guy that ruins everyone's fun if I think it calls for it. Um, I don't know if the goal should ever be to make it less awkward. Well, maybe it's more like the goal shouldn't be to make it less awkward. It might be to make people more open to feeling awkward, because there's kind of no ways around it. There's a very uh, uh, around campuses in the States and in the UK as well, they sometimes have the conversation of safe spaces, right? Making campuses safe spaces for us to think about stuff. But one of my professors, funny enough, some years ago was talking about how, well, we should change that from safe spaces to brave spaces because, sometimes you need to have these conversations and we can't quite call them safe spaces anymore, which I thought was really interesting because when the whole conversation of safe spaces started, the conservatives were attacking it because they're like, you can't universities shouldn't be safe spaces. But conservatives were onto something that, yes, although they might have gotten there differently, but they were onto something that these conversations are difficult. They're not going to be fun all the time. And so safety I mean, if you're safe all the time intellectually, how much are you really learning about stuff? How much are you actually being pushed? How much are you questioning what you came to the table with? And so, if we can allow for certain people to be uncomfortable in some settings, because most people would, like most people might say that, okay, maybe white folks need to be uncomfortable in some settings, and some people might accept that as a good thing. If we're willing to accept that some forms of discomfort are good, then we need to have an honest conversation about how broad that net goes, and there's room for all of us to be uncomfortable in many instances, in many conversations, and there's no way around getting rid of the discomfort. It might just be a conversation about not being so afraid of it.
Right, well said. I also wanted to talk to you about language. You once said, the limits of my language mean the limits of my world. And on the road to freedom, we lose something of ourselves in the process. So, first of all, the first quote on the limits of my language mean the limits of my world. What did you mean by that?
I don't remember saying that, which is so funny. The limits of my language. Yeah. Was I quoting someone? That's so interesting. Yeah, I don't remember saying that. But there are many different ways to, I guess, approach that, depending on who you ask, and there's good reason to believe this. The way you think about the world is shaped by your language, and the way you classify things, the way you approach things, the way you group things together, the way you the way you call things is shaped by the languages that you use. And so if you, at least in principle, have an understanding of different languages, which doesn't necessarily mean being able to speak different languages, but if you have an understanding of different languages, it does help understand the world a little bit better. Well, it is an interesting thing because also depending on who you ask, there's almost no such thing as like a direct translation from one language to the other. Once you translate, you interpret, you put yourself into it a little bit and you make choices. And so it's interesting to see how the same concept can just be experienced differently when people who see the world in different languages encounter it. I think understanding that about the world we live in is an important step to being more thoughtful about the people around you. And on the second question of we lose something on the road to freedom, I think I do remember that. That was in the context of it was a story I told, right, of a classmate of mine suggesting that Caliban in Aimé Césaire's telling of The Tempest, Caliban is not free because at the end of the play he sings in English. And so he's lost, or in whatever language that's not his native language, and so therefore Caliban is not free. And my response at the time was, well, I mean, I'm speaking in English, and I think I'm free. The fact that I'm speaking in English doesn't mean that I'm not free. It just means that you lose something of yourself on the way to freedom. And that was like 17-year-old me's take on it. And present day me would uphold that statement. You do lose something on the way to freedom. Does language fall into that category? So if your language dies out and you are left speaking English, might that be a greater loss than that statement of mine acknowledges? It might be. I don't know. Yeah, I don't have a great answer for this particular question. It's a difficult one.
Right. It's very interesting, though. The whole concept of language. It's very interesting. I mean, Gugi Wadonga passed a few days ago, which is sad. But he was, I mean, he also made a TikTok about this, about how, like, Gugi Wadonga wrote a book on, like, he was, like, a proponent of writing in African languages and stuff like that. Do you think that we have lost something as Africans, given that we're not speaking, like, African languages for the most part? You're speaking, like, English, for example. Do you think that in a way we've lost something? I mean, we may have lost, I guess, our languages because our languages are slowly but surely dying. but still amid that, like we've been able to still use English as a tool for um televising a revolution.
Yeah.
Not quoting Kendrick Lamar.
Yeah. I think if the question is, have we lost something? I would say yes. What that thing is, I don't know. And I think some of the options that try to explain what that thing is, I'm a bit wary to accept. So there are those who would say that, I mean, we've lost our souls or our sense of selves because of that. And I don't know how I feel about that. I mean, partly maybe this is me being biased because I have a stake in this game. I only speak English fluently, and I would think, I mean, if someone wants to suggest that I am not as soul-filled as my father or as my grandfather or something because of that, I mean, maybe I would accept that because I guess the solution is just to go learn the language and then become soul-filled, perhaps. Because yeah, my language is not dead at the moment, so I could go learn it, and I would see that as a beneficial thing to do. But as I am right now, am I less than what I could be? The soul in the soul category because of that? I don't really know how to quantify such a thing. It might be possible that yeah, I am. But I don't know. So have we lost something? Yes. What is it? I don't know, but it's something.
Right, something that you could be is very interesting. That's a very interesting question because I mean, something that you could be. I mean, you are who you are right now. If you could be someone else that couldn't have been who you are, so in a way, I don't know. I don't think that someone. I think yeah, true. Someone loses an element of themselves because you have to learn this new language, and sometimes subscribe to the terms that are brought forth by the language. But what I'm optimistic about is the fact that we still have the capability of reclamation despite losing our languages. Yeah. The final question I usually ask is what you do to change or improve the education system.
The answer would certainly change based on where I'm looking. Uh, some of the problems here in the States do not really exist back home. It is very problematic that universities are stupidly expensive here. That's less than ideal. Um, uh, the debt problem is an issue, and it the question is kind of up in the air if most students are really getting the most out of this at all. That question is still we're still deciding what's up with that. Uh, I think in Nigeria there are a few. So there's one somewhat pragmatic thing that I think might help. Uh, Before I get into anything more, I guess, fundamental or structural, I do think it's a bit strange that we have high rates of illiteracy back home, and I'm a bit skeptical as to how we get those numbers because if if literacy is defined by being able to read and write in English, then okay. But we need to take into account the fact that there are at least a few million Nigerians that read and write in Arabic for religious reasons, but that's not part of their education at all. So you can't go to school, to my knowledge, in Nigeria in Arabic for primary school or secondary school. And in my view, I think that's less than ideal because if they're already learning the language for religious reasons, put them in school and have them learn everything else in Arabic so that at least they'll be highly educated, especially up north where a lot of these problems are. Historically speaking, around the world, mosques have been sites of education as well as religious devotion. And so you don't need to erect that many structures. The mosques already exist. Uh, get people who teach these things to also teach a little bit of history, geometry, math, philosophy. Have them do it in Arabic. And if the downside to that would be that we would have a whole section of the country that was educated in Arabic and don't speak English very well, I mean, Arabic is a strong language. There's always a desire back home to kind of leave and go abroad and whatnot. And if a lot of people want to go to the US or to the UK or to an English-speaking country, cool. But if we now have a large segment of the population highly educated and would fit in perfectly in an Arabic-speaking country, then that's cool. They can always go there as well and do fun stuff. And if that just means that Arabic would become another official language. I mean, that's a conversation we could have, I suppose. That wouldn't exactly be an apocalyptic type thing. But I think that I mentioned this example because it showcases how there are many solutions to some of the problems that we lament a lot about the education system back home. And a little bit of thinking more three-dimensionally can help. If we be very clear as to what we mean by literate, because I'm not really sure how Nigeria defines that, and I think that's a bit of a problem in a country like Nigeria. If we define it really just based on English, then that might be a bit less than ideal. But if there are people that speak different languages, send them to school in those languages. It wouldn't be the worst thing in the world. That's something that we can keep in mind. As for some of the issues with tertiary education and universities back home, this is a tricky one. Thinking about academia across Africa is, back in the day, this was going to be one of my main things of focus. When I was initially thinking of doing a PhD, so the question I wanted to tackle, what it would look like to I guess revolutionize or I guess build upon, quote unquote, the African Academy. What things might we have to do? How might we play around with how we approach language? How might we play around with pedagogy? All of that stuff. I don't have great answers for these questions. There's always the existential question in a country like Nigeria: what comes first? Do we reform the universities so they can change the country, or do we change the country so that it's easier for the universities to flourish? I think pragmatically, it's probably easier to change the universities. I think if we revolutionize the universities, whatever that looks like, and get a populace that can go out into the country and not accept BS, which is, I think, part of the freedom aspect of education. If you know what you are worth and you know what you deserve as a human being, as a citizen, then you won't tolerate the annoying things that our politicians do. And if that happens to lead to some sort of revolution, then I guess that wouldn't be the worst thing in the world. But the Nigerian case is difficult. I have, as always, no definitive answers, I fear.
It's interesting how you've said, if you know what you're worth, you'll not tolerate I'm paraphrasing, the atrocities of the government, which is very interesting. I feel like that's actually a very good answer because, as you've said, like just knowing your worth will make you like know how much value like you have, when you want something. Because I feel like many a time, most especially in the African context, sometimes like human life is lost, say in protest, and politicians say, "Oh, people are just prone to die." And they can't even be accountable for that because they're like, oh, I mean, people die. I mean, mortality, biology, stuff like that. But it has been an honor to have you in the podcast. Thank you so much for being in the podcast and for creating amazing content.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that. Thank you.
All right.